The storm raged over the Carpathian Mountains, the wind howling through the jagged peaks like a choir of lost souls. Lightning ripped the sky open, illuminating the silhouette of an ancient convent perched on the cliffside. Its spires clawed at the heavens, defiant against centuries of decay. The stone walls wept rainwater, blackened with moss and age. From inside, faint chanting drifted into the night, rising and falling with the rhythm of the thunder. A candle flickered in a small chapel deep within the convent. Hooded figures stood in a circle, their voices low, their Latin broken and hurried. In the center lay a book bound in leather so dark it seemed to drink the candlelight. A crucifix hung above, but the Christ figure had been gouged away, leaving only the bare wood. One of the nuns, her face pale and hollow-eyed, trembled as she turned the pages. The others kept their heads bowed, but fear writhed in their posture. The ritual was not holy. It was desperate. They sought to seal something that had been awakened in the convent's undercroft, something ancient and vile. For weeks, the sisters had heard the whispers in the walls, the soft laughter in the dark. Some claimed to see a figure lurking in the corridors, a nun taller than any woman they knew, face hidden beneath the veil, eyes like glowing embers. One sister had disappeared after venturing into the basement alone. When they found her, her body was kneeling in prayer, though her face was frozen in a scream. The thunder cracked above as the ritual reached its crescendo. The lead nun, her voice quivering, pressed her bloodied palm onto the pages of the book and shouted the final words. For a moment, silence fell. The candle sputtered out, leaving the chapel in suffocating darkness. Then from the shadows came a hiss, low, guttural, inhuman. Something moved, brushing against the stone. The nuns clutched each other, eyes wide, but before anyone could scream, the sound erupted into laughter. Cold, cruel, endless laughter that seemed to seep into their bones. Lightning burst through the stained glass, illuminating the figure standing at the far end of the chapel. A nun's habit, black as midnight, clung to a frame impossibly tall, shoulders hunched, hands long and skeletal. The veil fluttered, though there was no breeze, and beneath it, two eyes glowed with sulfur light. The figure tilted its head, watching them. The sisters fell to their knees, praying, but the words slipped from their tongues like broken glass. The last thing they saw before the thunder drowned their cries was the figure's mouth stretching into an inhuman grin. The convent was found days later by villagers. Every sister was dead, their bodies arranged in a circle around the blackened book, faces contorted in terror. The chapel smelled of burnt flesh, though no fire had touched it. The convent was abandoned after that night, its gates locked, its halls left to rot. Yet stories whispered that the figure still walked the ruins, a shadow nun cursed to wander forever. Some said she was the devil in disguise. Others said she was something far older. Centuries passed, and the convent fell into ruin. Stones crumbled, vines strangled the spires, and the chapel roof caved under the weight of winters. Yet the shadow of the nun lingered, passed down through tales of travelers who dared near the cliffs. Some vanished, others returned with eyes hollow and lips cracked from murmuring prayers that no one could understand. The land was cursed, they said, cursed with a presence that could not be banished. Far from Romania, in a small town across the ocean, Sarah Hale did not know of these legends. She was a young nurse, weary from her night shifts at St. Augustine's Hospital, a building that itself carried decades of silent history. The hospital was old, built in the early 1900s, with long white corridors and high-arched ceilings. The walls smelled of antiseptic and decay, as though the air itself remembered the thousands who had died there. Few liked to work the night shift, but Sarah needed the hours. She liked the quiet, or at least she used to. It was a Tuesday when the first strange thing happened. The power flickered around midnight, the fluorescent lights humming and then going dark. Only the emergency lights came on, casting a weak red glow along the hallways. Sarah, carrying her lantern and a stack of patient files, walked down the east wing toward room 204. The hospital was unusually silent. Even the machines seemed to hold their breath. She rounded the corner and froze. At the far end of the corridor stood a figure. It was dressed in black and white, the unmistakable silhouette of a nun. The veil draped over her face, hiding every feature, but Sarah could feel the weight of eyes on her. A chill crept across her skin. Her hospital had no nuns. There hadn't been any for decades, not since the chapel was closed after a fire in the 70s. She blinked hard. thinking her tired mind was playing tricks. But when her eyes opened, the figure was still there. Silent. Watching. "Hello?" Sarah called, her voice thin in the silence. The nun did not answer. She only tilted her head, as though studying Sarah from afar. For reasons Sarah could not explain, the movement made her stomach twist with dread. She took a step back, heart pounding. The lantern flickered in her hand, shadows stretching and collapsing along the walls. She turned, ready to retreat, but when she looked back, the corridor was empty. The figure was gone. That night, she told herself it was exhaustion. Too many shifts, too little sleep. She laughed it off in the break room, though no one else was there to hear her. But deep down, she felt the unease burrow into her bones. The next night, it happened again. She was walking past the old chapel, now sealed and unused, when she heard the sound of soft footsteps behind her. Turning quickly, she saw nothing. Only the echoing corridor, empty under the red lights. But when she reached the end of the hallway, she glanced at the glass window of a door and caught her breath. Reflected in the glass was not her own face, but the veiled outline of a nun standing directly behind her. She spun, heart slamming against her ribs. Nothing. Empty air. Her reflection in the glass showed only herself now, pale and trembling. By the third night, Sarah began to dread her shifts. The figure was no longer distant. She glimpsed it closer each time, by the nurse's station, in the doorway of patients' rooms, in the reflection of surgical tools. Always watching, always silent. Once she passed the maternity ward and swore she heard low laughter echoing from inside, though every crib was empty. Another time she found patient files scattered on the floor in a perfect circle, though no one admitted to touching them. She tried to confide in her colleague Mark, but he only chuckled nervously. "This place is haunted, everyone knows it. Old buildings, old stories. You're just seeing things." Yet she noticed the way his eyes darted to the chapel doors when he spoke, as though he too felt the weight of something lurking in its shadow. One evening, she was tending to an elderly patient who had been muttering prayers all day. The woman clutched Sarah's wrist suddenly, her nails digging into the skin. "Don't let her in," the patient whispered, eyes wide and glassy. "She walks the halls. The one with the black veil. She wants your name." Before Sarah could ask, the woman convulsed violently, the monitor shrieking. By the time the doctors arrived, she was gone. Her final words echoed in Sarah's ears all night. That was when the dreams began. In them, Sarah wandered endless corridors that stretched far beyond the hospital's walls. The floors were wet, the air thick with the stench of rot. Somewhere ahead, a voice whispered her name, dragging it out syllable by syllable. When she turned corners, she saw the nun's silhouette just out of reach, her veil dripping as though soaked in blood. The dreams always ended the same way, with a cold hand gripping her wrist and a face with burning eyes inches from her own. Each morning she woke drenched in sweat, her heart racing as though she had been running. She began avoiding mirrors, for in the reflection of her tired eyes, she sometimes glimpsed the veil. Sleep offered no rest, and waking brought no safety. The line between dream and reality blurred, and one night, when the lantern in her hand flickered out, she felt a hand, ice-cold, skeletal, wrap around her wrist in the real world. Sarah dropped the lantern when the cold fingers gripped her wrist. The glass shattered on the floor, flames sputtering before dying in a hiss of smoke. Darkness closed in, broken only by the red glow of the emergency lights. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to scream, but her voice wouldn't come. Slowly, she turned her head. No one was there. Her wrist, however, still burned with the sensation of being held, as though frost had seeped into her veins. She stumbled back against the wall, clutching her chest. Her heartbeat roared in her ears. It was then she noticed the corridor ahead was no longer empty. The nun stood halfway down the hall. This time, she was clearer than ever before. The veil concealed most of her face, but Sarah caught glimpses of chalk-white skin, lips split as though they had never healed. Her hands hung at her sides, long and thin, the fingers ending in nails too black to be human. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She only watched. Sarah forced herself to whisper, "What do you want?" The nun's head tilted slightly and a sound escaped her. It wasn't speech, not at first. It was a hiss, rising, twisting until words formed from the broken tone. "Your name." Sarah stumbled back, shaking her head. "No, no!" The lights flickered violently, then steadied again. The nun was gone. Sarah slid down against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. She wanted to run from the hospital, but she knew she couldn't abandon her patients. Still, something inside her told her this was only the beginning. The following day, she found herself researching the hospital's history. She sat in the dusty records room, thumbing through old files. Most were mundane: renovations, staff lists, medical journals. But one newspaper clipping caught her eye. It was dated 1928, "Hospital Chapel Closed After Tragedy," the headline read. Beneath it, a photo of the East Wing chapel doors, the same ones that now stood sealed and unused. The article described a fire that had broken out during a storm. Several patients and a priest had died. Witnesses claimed they heard screaming from the basement long before the flames reached it. Some swore they saw a woman in a nun's habit walking through the smoke untouched by the fire. The hospital denied these claims, citing hysteria. Sarah's skin prickled as she read. She couldn't shake the thought of the convent in Romania she'd stumbled across in an old library book months before, while studying ancient prayers. The story of a ruined chapel, a dead order of nuns, and a veiled figure who haunted the ruins. She dismissed it back then as folklore. Now she wasn't so sure. That night she avoided the East Wing entirely, staying close to the nurses' station. Mark noticed her nerves. "You're pale," he said, sipping his coffee. "Night shift's catching up." She wanted to tell him everything, but stopped herself. He would laugh, or worse, think she was losing her mind. Instead, she shrugged. "Just tired." The hours crawled. At 3 a.m, she heard soft singing. It was faint, barely audible, but it drifted down the hall like a hymn carried on the wind. She stood, heart hammering, straining to listen. The words were in Latin, though she couldn't understand. The voice was beautiful but wrong, too low, too distorted, like multiple voices speaking at once. She followed it before realizing she was walking toward the sealed chapel. The singing stopped as she reached the doors. The wood was old, scorched, with crosses carved into its surface. She reached out, trembling, and placed her hand against it. Instantly, her body stiffened. Images flooded her mind: nuns kneeling in prayer, their mouths sewn shut with black thread. A book on the altar, its pages dripping blood. The veiled figure standing among them, laughing as the storm raged outside. She tore her hand back, gasping for air. The doors rattled violently as though something inside was pushing against them. Sarah staggered away, clutching her ears as whispers erupted around her. They said her name again and again, overlapping until the sound was unbearable. She ran down the corridor, not stopping until she reached the stairwell. Mark found her there 20 minutes later, shaking and pale. He crouched beside her, concern etched across his face. "Sarah, what happened?" She wanted to lie again, but the words spilled out. She told him about the figure, the voice, the chapel. To her surprise, he didn't laugh. He only looked away, chewing his lip. "I've heard things too," he admitted finally. "Doors slamming when no one's there. Whispers in the vents. Once I saw a woman by the nursery. Thought it was one of the old nuns they used to have here. When I blinked, she was gone." Sarah's eyes widened. "So I'm not imagining it." He shook his head. "This place has stories. My grandmother used to tell me the hospital was cursed. Said it was built on land bought from a church that burned down. The priests warned them not to disturb the ground. They did anyway." Sarah felt cold seep through her. The pieces were fitting together: an ancient convent, a cursed land, a chapel fire. And now the figure hunting her. That night she dreamed again. This time she was back in the convent itself. The walls dripped with water, the air heavy with incense and rot. She walked through endless corridors, her lantern barely cutting the darkness. Ahead she saw the nun standing with her back turned. Sarah froze, but her feet kept moving, pulled forward by some unseen force. The figure turned slowly, revealing not one face but many. Screaming mouths fused together, eyes weeping black tears. Sarah woke with a scream. The sheets tangled around her. Her wrist burned again, the same spot where the hand had gripped her. She stumbled to the bathroom and turned on the light. Her skin was marked with faint bruises, like the outline of long, bony fingers. By the following week, she was unraveling. Her coworkers noticed her fatigue, the way she jumped at shadows. Patients muttered about a woman in black walking the halls. One child, feverish and delirious, cried out for his mother in the night. "Make the bad nun go away," he sobbed. Sarah sat with him until dawn, her own fear swallowing her whole. Mark suggested they investigate the chapel. If we see what's inside, maybe it'll put this to rest, he said, though his voice shook with doubt. Sarah hesitated. Every part of her screamed against it, but deep down she knew they had no choice. The figure was not going away. It was getting closer. 2 nights later, they stood before the sealed doors. Mark had brought a crowbar, his hands slick with sweat. Sarah clutched her lantern, her heart thundering. With a grunt, Mark pried at the wood. It groaned and splintered, dust raining down. The doors gave way with a final crack, opening just enough for them to slip inside. The chapel was cold. The air smelled of ash and damp stone. The pews were charred, the altar blackened, yet the crucifix still hung above, its Christ figure erased. Candles sat melted into puddles along the floor, though no one had been inside for decades. Sarah's eyes fell on the center of the room. There, scorched into the stone, was a circle. Around it, black marks like claw scratches dug deep into the floor. In the middle lay a book, its cover cracked but intact. The same book she had seen in her vision. The lantern flickered as she stepped forward. "Don't," Mark whispered, but she couldn't stop. She reached down, fingertips brushing the leather. It was ice cold, colder than the air around them. As she touched it, the chapel seemed to sigh. The shadows shifted, and then the singing returned. This time it was deafening, echoing through the walls, shaking the floor. The doors slammed shut behind them, plunging the room into darkness. Sarah clutched the book to her chest as the veil of blackness thickened around them. From the shadows the nun emerged, her eyes burned like embers. Her mouth split wide, revealing not teeth but endless blackness. She raised one skeletal hand and pointed at Sarah. "Your name," she whispered. The lantern shattered and the chapel fell into pure darkness, and her wrist in the real world. The darkness pressed against Sarah's skin like a living thing. She clutched the book tighter, her breath ragged, her eyes darting wildly for even a shred of light. Mark's hand brushed hers in the pitch black. "Don't move," he whispered, though his voice was trembling. The chapel was alive with sound. The singing had turned to murmuring, countless voices overlapping, speaking in tongues Sarah didn't recognize. They whispered between the pews and the rafters beneath the floor. It was as though the walls themselves had mouths. The air grew heavy, choking them with every breath. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the figure for only a second. The nun was closer now, her face inches from Sarah's, her yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. Sarah stumbled backwards, screaming. When the light vanished, the figure was gone again, but her laughter remained, rolling through the chapel like thunder. "Sarah," the voice hissed, drawn out and broken. "Sarah." Mark seized her arm and pulled her toward the doors. They rammed against the wood, but it wouldn't budge. Something was holding it shut. Sarah beat her fists against it, tears stinging her eyes. Behind her she heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing down the aisle. "Sarah." The book in her hands grew hotter, burning her palms. She cried out, nearly dropping it, but Mark covered her hands with his, helping her hold it. "Don't let go," he shouted. His voice was desperate, but Sarah understood. The book was the key, the reason this thing was bound here. A violent gust of wind roared through the chapel, snuffing out even the emergency lights that had bled faintly through the cracks. Now there was nothing. Pure suffocating black. Sarah's own heartbeat was deafening in her ears. Then a whisper brushed against her ear, as cold as ice. "Give me your name," Sarah screamed and shoved back, swinging the book wildly through the dark. She felt it strike something solid. A screech ripped through the chapel, inhuman and deafening. The doors burst open behind them, and a rush of cold air swept through. Mark yanked her through the gap, and together they stumbled into the corridor. The doors slammed shut with a final thunderous crack. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Sarah collapsed against the wall, shaking violently. Her hands throbbed from clutching the book. Mark's face was as pale as the dead, sweat running down his temple. "What the hell was that?" he gasped. Sarah looked at the scorched leather cover. It had no title, only strange symbols burned into its surface. "It's her," she whispered. "That thing, this book, it's tied to her," Mark swore under his breath. "We should burn it." Sarah shook her head. "No. If it's binding her, destroying it might release her completely." Neither of them slept that night. Sarah kept the book in her apartment, hidden beneath her bed, though its presence made the air in her home feel colder, heavier. She dreamed again, always the nun, always calling her name. Each time she woke, the book was lying on her chest, though she never remembered moving it. Days passed, and the hospital grew worse. Patients whispered of a woman in black who came to their rooms at night. A man in recovery clawed at his own eyes, screaming that she wouldn't stop staring at him. A nurse quit without notice after claiming she saw someone following her into the staff bathroom. Sarah and Mark met in secret, trying to piece together what they had found. Old archives, newspaper clippings, even rumors passed down through staff. They discovered that the hospital was indeed built on land once belonging to a convent that had burned down under mysterious circumstances. Some articles mentioned strange rituals, whispers of heresy, though nothing concrete. One fragment, however, chilled Sarah to the bone. It described a nun accused of betraying her sisters during a ritual meant to seal away evil. Instead, she embraced it, binding herself to its power. Her name was erased from records, struck from history, replaced only with a title, the Veiled One. Sarah knew then that the figure wasn't merely a ghost. It was something older, something that had once worn human skin but had been twisted by the very darkness it sought to control. The book was her tether. The only question was whether it kept her bound or whether it was slowly letting her free. One night, Sarah awoke to find her apartment colder than ever. Her breath fogged in the air. She sat up, dread coiling in her stomach, and froze. The nun stood in the corner of her bedroom. Her veil fluttered, though there was no wind. Her body bent unnaturally, her spine arched, her head tilting far too far to one side. Her hands twitched at her sides. The air was thick with rot and incense. Sarah reached for the lamp, but it didn't turn on. She grabbed the book from under her bed, clutching it to her chest. The nun took a step forward, her bare feet soundless against the floor. Sarah's skin prickled with every inch she closed. "Your name," the nun whispered, her voice layered with countless tones. Some human, some not. "Give it, and you will be mine." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "No!" The nun's laughter filled the room, so loud Sarah thought the windows would shatter. She lunged forward, impossibly fast, and suddenly her face was inches from Sarah's. Those yellow eyes burned into her, searing her soul. The veil brushed her cheek, damp and cold. Sarah screamed, clutching the book tighter, and then it stopped. The room was empty again. The nun was gone. But the book in her hands was open now, though she hadn't opened it. The pages writhed with symbols, shifting and rearranging like living things, and scrawled across the first page, in a language she shouldn't have understood, was her own name. Sarah dropped the book with a cry. Her heart thundered in her chest. The book knew her name. It had written itself into its cursed pages. She barely slept after that. The next day she found Mark and showed him. His face turned ashen as he traced the letters. "It's binding itself to you," he said grimly. "You're not just seeing her anymore. You're part of this." Sarah buried her face in her hands. "What do I do?" Mark hesitated, then lowered his voice. "We need help. Someone who knows how to deal with this. A priest, an exorcist, something." That evening, Mark made some calls, pulling strings he didn't explain. He told Sarah to meet him at the chapel the next night. "Bring the book," he said. "We'll end this." Sarah dreaded the hours that followed. The nun's presence never left her. She saw her in every reflection, heard her voice in every silence. Even walking down the street, she felt eyes on her from the shadows. By the time midnight came, she was shaking with exhaustion and fear. She entered the hospital chapel once more, lantern in one hand, the cursed book in the other. Mark was already there, speaking with an older man in a dark coat. His face was stern, his eyes sharp but tired, as though he had seen too much already. "This is Father Kalen," Mark said. "He knows about these things." The priest eyed the book warily. "That's no relic of God," he said softly. "It's a covenant, and if her name is in it." His gaze flicked to Sarah. "Then she is marked." Sarah's knees nearly buckled. "Can it be undone?" The priest sighed, opening his satchel. Inside were rosaries, vials of holy water, and a worn crucifix. "Perhaps, but it will not let her go easily. You must understand, this is not simply a spirit. This is a hunger. It will not rest until it consumes you." Before Sarah could respond, the air in the chapel grew colder. The lantern flickered. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting into unnatural shapes. The priest gripped his crucifix, his lips moving in prayer. Mark backed toward Sarah, his hand on her shoulder. And then, from the darkness, she emerged, the nun, taller than before, her veil fluttering as though alive. Her grin stretched wide, impossibly wide. Her laughter shook the very floor. She lifted one skeletal hand, pointing at Sarah, and the voices erupted once more, chanting her name in endless, broken harmony. The priest raised his crucifix, shouting prayers over the din. The nun only laughed harder, the sound curdling the air. The book in Sarah's arms grew heavier, its pages fluttering wildly, as though caught in a storm. She clutched it desperately, unsure whether to drop it or hold it tighter. The nun stepped closer, her burning eyes fixed on Sarah. "Your name," she whispered again, soft but irresistible, echoing in Sarah's skull. "Give me your name." And Sarah felt her lips part against her will. The hospital at night always seemed like a different world. By day it was crowded with the sounds of doctors, nurses, patients, and families moving in and out of its halls. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, silence took over. Sarah Walker knew this silence well. She had been a nurse here for nearly 5 years. And though the graveyard shift was never easy, she had grown used to the rhythm of quiet footsteps echoing off tiled floors, the hum of the vending machine down the hall, and the faint scent of antiseptic that clung to every corner. But lately that silence carried something heavier, something that felt like it was listening, waiting. She tried not to think about it as she walked toward the staff lounge. Her sneakers squeaked faintly on the linoleum floor, and her shadow stretched long under the dim fluorescent lights. She hated how the lights buzzed and flickered sometimes, as if they were about to give up. It wasn't just the lights that felt like they were giving up, though. The entire hospital felt old, exhausted, and broken, like the building itself carried a burden no one wanted to acknowledge. "Coffee again?" A voice called behind her. Sarah turned and saw David, one of the security guards, leaning against the wall with his usual tired grin. He was tall, broad-shouldered, but his kind eyes made him seem less intimidating than his uniform suggested. He looked just as sleep-deprived as she was. "Better coffee than passing out mid-shift," Sarah said, forcing a smile. David chuckled softly. "True, but don't drink too much. Last time you were jittery for hours," she shrugged. "Jittery's better than hearing things in the dark." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and David raised an eyebrow. "Hearing things?" Sarah hesitated. She didn't want to sound crazy, but it wasn't the first time someone on staff had complained about the strange atmosphere in the hospital after midnight. Rumors floated around, strange whispers, footsteps when no one was there, a figure glimpsed at the end of a corridor that vanished when you looked twice. Most people laughed it off, but Sarah had seen enough to know better. "It's nothing," she muttered quickly. "Just lack of sleep." David studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, lack of sleep will do that." He pushed away from the wall. "I'll do a round before heading back to the office." "You be careful." She nodded, grateful for his presence, even if he didn't know what really bothered her. She continued on to the lounge, poured herself a lukewarm cup of coffee, and tried not to think about the way the shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should be. Hours crawled by. Midnight turned into 1 a.m., then 2. Patients slept fitfully in their rooms, their machines beeping steadily. Nurses whispered in the halls, their voices low, as if speaking too loudly would wake something other than the patients. Sarah checked vitals, changed IVs, and did her rounds like always. But then, while walking down the east corridor, she felt it again, that presence. She paused midway down the hall. Something about it felt wrong tonight, heavier than usual. The air was colder, and she could hear the faintest sound, like soft footsteps ahead. She swallowed, forcing her voice steady. "Hello? Anyone there?" Silence. She told herself it could just be another staff member. Maybe one of the janitors. But when she stepped forward, the corridor stretched unnaturally long, the far end swallowed in shadow. And then she saw it, just for a moment. A figure standing at the very end. Her heart skipped a beat. It looked like a woman, dressed in black and white, a veil covering most of her face. She stood perfectly still, hands folded as if in prayer. Sarah blinked and the figure was gone. Her hands trembled, the clipboard shaking in her grasp. She forced herself to breathe, to keep walking, but every step made her feel like something was watching her from just out of sight. When she finally reached the nurse's station, she collapsed into the chair, trying to steady herself. "You look pale," her coworker Maria said, glancing up from her paperwork. I thought I saw someone, Sarah whispered. At the end of the corridor, Maria frowned. You're not the first one. I swear this place is haunted. Some of the older staff say a nun used to walk these halls back when the hospital was built over an old monastery. They say she still lingers. Sarah froze. A nun? Maria nodded. Yeah, creepy, right? My aunt worked here before me. She said the nun wasn't just any ghost. She was cursed. Something to do with a ritual gone wrong. I don't know the details, but they say she's searching for something, or someone. Sarah's throat felt dry. She wanted to dismiss it as a silly ghost story, but deep down, she knew what she had seen. That night, Sarah didn't sleep after her shift ended. Even when she went home, showered, and tried to rest, her mind kept circling back to the nun in the corridor. She could still feel those unseen eyes watching her, following her even outside the hospital. Over the next few days, the sightings continued. Always at night, always at the end of some dark hallway. Sometimes Sarah would hear faint whispers in Latin, though she couldn't understand them. Sometimes she'd catch the sound of footsteps behind her, only to turn and find no one there. She stopped mentioning it to her coworkers, afraid they'd think she was losing her mind, but she wasn't the only one. One evening, during another night shift, she found David sitting in his office, pale and shaken. His hands trembled as he clutched a half-empty cup of coffee. Are you okay? She asked, stepping inside. He looked up at her, eyes wide. I saw her. Sarah's blood ran cold. The nun? He nodded. I was doing my rounds in the basement. The cameras picked up movement, so I went to check. And there she was, just standing there. But when I shined my flashlight, she was gone. Sarah sat across from him, her heart pounding. For the first time, she felt a strange relief. She wasn't imagining it. Someone else had seen her, too. What do we do? She whispered. David shook his head. I don't know. But whatever this thing is, it doesn't belong here. And I don't think it's harmless. As if to prove his point, the hospital intercom crackled suddenly even though no one had touched it. A distorted voice hissed through the speakers. Low, guttural, and filled with malice. Sarah and David froze, staring at each other. Then the voice whispered two words that made Sarah's blood turn to ice. Find me. The words from the intercom lingered in Sarah's mind long after the sound faded. Find me. They weren't just random whispers. They were directed, personal, like the entity knew her, like it wanted her specifically. The thought made her skin crawl. David slammed the intercom switch off, but the static kept hissing for a few more seconds before it finally died. The two sat in silence, too shaken to speak. The air in the security office felt heavy, as if someone invisible had just been standing there between them. I don't like this, David muttered finally. That wasn't some prank. That wasn't feedback. That was something else. Sarah nodded mutely. She could feel her pulse in her temples, pounding like drums. She wanted to run, to leave the hospital and never come back, but she knew she couldn't. She needed the job. And more than that, something deep inside her told her that if she tried to run, the nun would follow. Her shift ended at 7 in the morning. By then, the sun had already begun to rise, and daylight poured into the hospital through tall windows, chasing away the night's oppressive gloom. Sarah should have felt relieved, but she didn't. The light didn't erase what she'd seen or heard. At home, she tossed her keys on the table and dropped onto the couch. Exhaustion tugged at her, but when she closed her eyes, she saw the figure again. Tall, looming, silent, her habit dark as ink against the pale walls of the corridor. Sarah jolted awake with a gasp. She didn't dare try again. The next day, she decided to dig deeper. During her lunch break, she slipped into the small hospital library. It wasn't much, just a dusty collection of medical texts, old reports, and a few historical records about the building. She had heard Maria mention that the hospital was built over the remains of a monastery. Maybe there was some truth to it. Hours passed as she sifted through yellowed documents and brittle pages. Most of it was mundane, records of construction, transfers of ownership, lists of staff. But then she found it, an article clipped from a local paper, dated over 70 years ago. It spoke of the St. Gertrude Monastery, once standing on the very land where the hospital now rose. The article described a tragedy. The monastery had burned down under mysterious circumstances. Only a handful of nuns survived. Among the dead was Sister Helena, a woman rumored to have been Unusual. The townspeople believed she practiced rites that were not of God, rites that invited darkness. Some said she had been punished by fire. Others whispered that she had not perished at all, that her soul lingered, bound to the place. Sarah's stomach turned as she traced her finger over Sister Helena's name. She thought of the figure she had seen, the nun in the corridor. Could it be her? The sound of footsteps interrupted her. She turned quickly, but no one was there. Still, she could feel the faint vibration of movement, as if someone had just walked past the shelves behind her. She stuffed the article into her pocket and hurried out. That night, during her shift, the atmosphere was worse than ever. The corridors were colder, the lights dimmer, the silence thicker. Sarah moved cautiously, every nerve in her body on edge. Near 3 a.m., while checking on the patients in Ward C, she heard it again. Soft whispers. They weren't in English. The words slithered through the air, ancient and foreign, chilling her to the bone. She stepped out into the hallway. The whispers grew louder, echoing from the far end. And there she was again, the nun. This time she didn't vanish when Sarah blinked. She stood there tall and rigid, her face still obscured by the shadow of her veil. Her hands were clasped tightly around what looked like a rosary, though the beads glowed faintly red, like embers. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The nun tilted her head slightly, almost in curiosity. Then she lifted her hand and pointed down the hall, toward the basement. Sarah felt her legs move before her mind agreed. She followed, her footsteps echoing softly, her breath shallow. The nun glided ahead of her, silent, almost floating. When Sarah reached the stairwell, the nun disappeared. The air grew colder and a stench rose up from the basement, damp stone, mold, and something metallic like old blood. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back. But the voice in her mind whispered again, "Find me." She descended. The basement was rarely used anymore. Most of the equipment had been moved to newer storage areas. The walls were rough stone, older than the rest of the hospital, remnants of the monastery's foundation. The light bulbs flickered weakly, casting long, trembling shadows. At the far end of the basement, Sarah noticed something odd. One section of the wall looked different, darker, like it had been patched or covered up. Curiosity overrode her fear. She reached out and pressed against it. The stone was loose. Before she could investigate further, a hand clamped onto her shoulder. She screamed and spun around, ready to fight, only to find David standing there, his face tense. "What the hell are you doing down here?" he hissed. Sarah's chest heaved. "She led me here." David's eyes darkened. "The nun?" Sarah nodded. She pointed. "Right to this place." David glanced at the wall, frowning. "I don't like this." He tapped it with his flashlight. The sound was hollow. "There's something behind it." Together they pried at the stones until one shifted loose. Dust poured out, choking the air. Behind the wall was a narrow passage, pitch black and cold. Sarah stared into the darkness, dread pooling in her stomach. "We shouldn't go in," she whispered. But the voice came again, stronger than ever, echoing inside her skull. "Find me." The tunnel beyond the broken wall was narrow and suffocating, lined with rough stones that seemed to close in on them the deeper they went. Their footsteps echoed hollowly, mingling with the faint drip of water somewhere ahead. The air was damp, stale, and bitterly cold, carrying the scent of earth long undisturbed. Sarah's flashlight beam wavered slightly as her trembling hand held it aloft, cutting through the suffocating black. David walked in front, his broader frame blocking some of the darkness, though even he moved with caution. "This wasn't on any of the hospital's blueprints," he muttered, his voice bouncing off the stone walls. "This is older," Sarah nodded silently. She knew it already. This wasn't part of the hospital at all. It belonged to the monastery, to its forgotten bones buried beneath layers of time. The passage sloped downward. Sarah's ears caught faint whispers again, growing stronger with each step. Her chest tightened. It was the same language she had heard in the corridors, the same dark chant curling like smoke around her thoughts. She couldn't understand the words, but she could feel them, each syllable pressing against her skin like invisible hands. The tunnel ended at a heavy wooden door, its surface cracked and blackened with age. Strange symbols were carved into it, jagged and sharp, half hidden under centuries of grime. David ran his fingers over the carvings. "These don't look like anything holy," he said grimly. Sarah's mouth was dry. "Do we open it?" Before David could answer, the door creaked on its own, swinging inward with a groan that rattled the stone around them. A blast of icy air rushed out, extinguishing the courage Sarah thought she had left. Inside was a chamber, circular and cavernous, its ceiling lost in shadow. Rusted iron candelabras lined the walls, their wax long melted into hardened stalactites. In the center lay a stone altar, its surface stained dark, as though countless rituals had been performed upon it. Chains dangled from the ceiling above, swaying gently though no breeze stirred. Sarah's stomach churned. She wanted to turn and run, but her legs carried her closer, drawn by something stronger than fear. On the altar lay a book, massive, bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed but intact. The cover bore the same symbols carved into the door. David's jaw tightened. This isn't right. We should seal this back up, but Sarah barely heard him. She was staring at the book, her ears ringing with the nun's whisper. "Find me." Her hand moved on its own, reaching toward the book. David caught her wrist. "Don't." His grip broke her trance, and she blinked, realizing how close she had been to touching it. She jerked back, heart racing. I don't know what came over me." David pulled her away. "This thing, this room, it's not meant to be found. Someone sealed it for a reason. We're leaving." Reluctantly, Sarah followed. But as they turned back toward the passage, a sound broke the silence, a low, guttural laugh. They froze. It came from the altar. The book had opened. Pages fluttered wildly, though no wind moved. The whispers swelled into a roar, filling the chamber, rattling the chains above. The temperature plummeted. Frost crawled over the stones. Then, from the corner of her eye, Sarah saw movement. The nun stepped out of the shadows, taller than she had remembered, her habit tattered as though burned. Her face was no longer hidden. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp bones, lips cracked and bloodless, eyes glowing a sickly yellow that burned with malice. The rosary in her hand dangled, its beads glowing red like coals from a fire that never died. Sarah's breath caught. David raised his flashlight and shined it on the figure, but the beam warped, bending unnaturally as though the light itself feared to touch her. The nun's voice filled the chamber, low and resonant, vibrating in Sarah's chest. "You opened the way." Sarah shook her head. "No, we didn't. You broke the seal," the nun continued, her voice growing harsher, almost two voices overlapping. "Now I will not be bound." David grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the passage. "Run!" They bolted, their footsteps pounding against the stone. Behind them, the nun's scream split the air, a sound not of this world, half human, half beast, filled with centuries of rage. The ground shook, dust raining from the ceiling as the chamber seemed to collapse in on itself. They burst out of the passage back into the basement, coughing and gasping. David shoved the loose stones back into place with frantic hands, as though closing the way could undo what they had unleashed. But Sarah knew it was too late. The nun had followed. For days after, the hospital was different. Shadows clung to the corners more thickly, the air colder than it should have been even with the heating on. Patients grew restless, their sleep disturbed by nightmares. Some swore they saw a woman in black and white standing at their bedsides. One elderly patient died suddenly in the night, her face twisted in terror, her hand clutching a rosary that wasn't hers. Sarah hardly slept at all. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the whispers. Every time she walked the halls, she felt the nun's eyes on her. She stopped telling David. He had grown quieter, more paranoid, constantly checking the cameras, though the feeds often flickered with static, showing glimpses of the nun in places she couldn't possibly be. One evening, Maria approached Sarah, pale and anxious. "Something's wrong. I think I saw her." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Where?" Maria's lips trembled. "In the chapel." The hospital had a small chapel on the first floor, mostly used by families seeking solace. Sarah hadn't gone there in years. She didn't want to, but Maria insisted. Together they entered. The chapel was dim, lit only by a single flickering candle before the altar. The air was thick with incense, though no one had lit any, and there, kneeling before the cross, was the nun. Her head was bowed, hands folded in mock prayer, her rosary glowing faintly. Sarah and Maria froze at the doorway. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to crawl across the walls. Then, slowly, the nun raised her head. Her eyes locked on Sarah's. "Find me," she whispered. The candle went out. Sarah staggered back as the chapel plunged into darkness. Maria clutched her arm tightly, trembling, whispering prayers under her breath. The silence after the candle died was suffocating, but Sarah could still feel those eyes in the blackness, staring through her, pulling her in. "Run!" Sarah hissed, dragging Maria toward the door, but the wooden doors slammed shut with a deafening bang before they could escape. The chapel groaned as if the very walls were alive, stone shifting, wood cracking. The crucifix above the altar tilted, then crashed to the ground, splintering into pieces. The nun's whisper filled the room again. "You opened the way. Now you are mine." Maria screamed as shadows spilled from the corners, writhing like snakes coiling around their feet. Sarah fought, pulling against them, but the darkness clung like tar, dragging her closer to the altar. The nun rose slowly, her veil fluttering though no wind stirred, her form swelling until she towered over them, eyes blazing with fire that seemed older than the earth. Sarah's mind flashed to the book, the altar in the hidden chamber, the chains hanging from above. It hadn't been just a seal. It had been a prison. They hadn't freed her, they had unleashed her. "No," Sarah shouted, forcing every ounce of strength into her voice. "You don't belong here." The nun tilted her head, lips curling into a grotesque smile. "This place is mine. It always was. It always will be." Maria sobbed, clutching her rosary, holding it out desperately as if it could ward the demon away. The nun's laughter filled the chapel, a sound so sharp it pierced Sarah's skull. The beads in Maria's hand cracked one by one, bursting into shards. "Faith will not save you," the nun hissed. Sarah's heart thundered. She had nothing, no prayers, no weapons, no hope. But then she remembered the book. She hadn't touched it. She had resisted even when it called to her. Maybe that was why the nun wanted her. "Maybe that was the key. You need me," Sarah said suddenly, her voice shaking. "That's why you haven't killed me yet. You want me to finish what you started." The nun's eyes narrowed, fire flickering in their depths. "You want me to read from the book?" Sarah pressed on, trembling. "To free you completely. Without me, you're still bound here." For a moment, silence hung heavy. The nun stared at her, expression unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. "Yes, you are chosen." Sarah's skin crawled at the word. Chosen, not blessed, cursed. She understood now. The nun wasn't asking to be found. She was hunting, searching for someone weak enough, desperate enough, to finish her work. But Sarah wasn't going to give her that. She wrenched her arm free from the shadows, lunged toward the broken crucifix, and grabbed a jagged piece of the cross. With a cry that tore her throat raw, she plunged it into the floor, right into the writhing shadow beneath her feet. The chapel shook violently. The shadow screamed, pulling back as if burned. The nun shrieked, her form twisting, unraveling at the edges. The walls cracked, dust raining from the ceiling. Maria pulled Sarah up, and together they stumbled toward the door. This time it gave way, bursting open with such force they nearly fell into the hallway. Behind them the chapel roared, collapsing in on itself, fireless flames devouring the darkness. They ran. Through the corridors, past rooms where patients cried out in their sleep, past the nurses' station where papers flew like leaves in a storm. The hospital itself seemed to convulse, as if the evil inside was tearing it apart from within. David appeared from around the corner, eyes wide. "What happened?" "No time," Sarah shouted. "We have to get out." The three of them sprinted for the exit, but as they neared the front doors, the air grew heavy again. The nun's voice followed them, echoing through every hallway, through every wall, a scream that was both rage and laughter. "You cannot escape me. I am eternal. Wherever you go, I will follow." The glass doors shattered outward as they pushed through, spilling into the night. The cold air hit Sarah like a wave, and for a moment she could breathe again. They collapsed onto the pavement, coughing, gasping, their hearts hammering. Behind them, the hospital windows glowed with an unnatural light, shadows writhing against the glass. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stilled. The lights flickered back to normal. The building stood silent, as though nothing had happened, but Sarah knew better. In the days that followed, the hospital reopened as if nothing had occurred. The chapel was reported under renovation, sealed off to anyone who asked. Patients continued to arrive. Doctors continued to work. Life continued as usual, but Sarah couldn't sleep. Every night she heard the whispers. Every night in the corner of her vision she saw the veil, the rosary, the eyes. Maria quit her job and moved away. David stayed but grew withdrawn, hollow, always watching the monitors with haunted eyes. And Sarah? She carried the weight of it. She carried the knowledge that she had been chosen. One night, weeks later, she woke in her apartment to the sound of soft footsteps. Her heart froze. She turned slowly toward the dark corner of her room. There she was. The nun. Standing silently, rosary in hand, eyes burning like fire. The whisper filled the room, soft and patient, curling around Sarah's soul like smoke. "Find me," Sarah screamed, and the lights went out.